welcome to a mini modern studies lesson on the democracy in Scotland topic. Today we're going to think about how decision making is divided across the United Kingdom and the different ways in which you are represented. So, we live in a constitutional monarchy, which means the Queen is the head of state, but in reality has very little, if any, political power. Here she is formally opening Parliament, but really that's the only thing she ever gets to do in Parliament.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons.
Decision making across the whole of the UK is by the central government, which means the UK Parliament at Westminster and the UK government, which is led currently by Boris Johnson. You'll know that famous door from 10 Downing Street where the Prime Minister often gives really important speeches.
But once again, I want to thank you, the people of this country, for the sheer grit and guts you've shown and are continuing to show. Every day, I know that this virus brings new sadness and mourning to households across the land.
In 1997, way back, there was a referendum, a vote of all the people in Scotland about whether there should be a Scottish Parliament which would deal with specific issues in Scotland, and 74% of people voted in favour of that.
But in the event, the final tally showed a huge majority for the pro-devolution camp on both questions. Just over 60% of those eligible to vote did so. Of those, almost three-quarters, 74%, supported a Scottish Parliament. Fewer than 26% voted against.
So the Scottish Parliament was created. Now this is an example of devolution, when you transfer power from the central government to devolved governments. After the Scottish Parliament was created, the same thing happened in the Welsh Assembly and the Northern Irish Assembly. England remains the only one of the four parts of the United Kingdom that doesn't have its own parliament, so their decisions are still made by the UK Parliament. So, now as well as you having an MP to represent you in the UK Parliament, you've got an MSP, a member of the Scottish Parliament, to represent you there as well. This is the inside of the debating chamber during First Minister's questions. We'll learn more about that in a future lesson. Now, when the Scottish Parliament was created, there was a list of specific powers drawn up to decide what would be devolved and what would be reserved by the UK Parliament. It's really important you know what these two words mean, devolved and reserved. So, think of reserved as if you're reserving a table in a restaurant. You want them to hold back the table for you and not to give it away to anyone else. That's what reserved powers are. The UK government centrally holding back certain powers so that decisions can be made across the whole of the United Kingdom, not individually by Scotland, Wales, England or Northern Ireland. Devolved just means the opposite. The powers have been transferred to the more local level. In other words, they've been given away by central government to the devolved governments. Let's have a look at some examples. The UK government reserves power over issues like national defence, foreign affairs, pensions, most benefits and immigration. The Scottish Parliament's got responsibility for issues like health, education, crime, justice, housing, farming and transport, and lots of other things. And this list hasn't stayed exactly the same since 1998. A number of powers have transferred to the Scottish Parliament since then, such as recently the right to change the amount of tax that people pay or control over some benefits. It will have to change again once Brexit happens, because there will be lots of decisions that need to be taken over issues that the European Union Parliament would previously have had a say on. Hopefully you're still with me so far. Here is a quick recap. Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, Nicola Sturgeon as the First Minister, deal with devolved matters like health, education, the police, the courts, housing and transport. The UK Parliament, the UK Government, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, they deal with reserved issues like defence, immigration, foreign affairs and most benefits. So, hopefully, now you've got some of the theory, but remember, to do really well in modern studies, you need up-to-date examples to back up your knowledge. So let's look at a specific example. In fact, Let's look at one that's going on right now, the coronavirus situation. It's a really good example of devolution in practice, and it's about as up to date as you can possibly get.
Very good morning, welcome to Breakfast with Dan Walker and Louise Minchin.
The headlines for you at 6 o'clock. Millions more people will be able to get tested for coronavirus from today, including all staff and residents of care homes.
The debate over whether to wear masks in public. Scotland becomes the latest country to recommend covering your face in shops and public transport.
A lot of the key decisions about how to deal with the coronavirus situation have been shared between the UK and the Scottish Government. For example, deciding the time at which we should all go into lockdown. However, key decisions about health policy have been made in Scotland by the Scottish Government. For example, they set up an emergency hospital in the Scottish Exhibition Centre in Glasgow called the Louisa Jordan. This was a decision made by the Scottish Government.
On the 30th of March, the First Minister announced the construction of the NHS Louisa Jordan as a safeguard in order to support the capacity of the NHS in Scotland. I can confirm that 3 weeks after that announcement, that construction will be completed today, and the NHS Louisa Jordan will stand ready to accept patients from tomorrow.
The Scottish Parliament also had to pass a new law, the Coronavirus Scotland Act, imaginatively named.
The result of the vote on motion number 21371 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 80. There were no votes against, there were no abstentions. The motion is agreed and the Coronavirus Scotland Bill is passed.
This law allowed the Scottish Government to make certain decisions, such as stopping people from being evicted from their home during the pandemic, or the right to release prisoners slightly earlier than planned to prevent the spread of the virus in prisons. The UK Parliament also passed a law on some of these issues, but that law would only affect people living in England. Now, there are some people who believe the devolution of powers from central government to the Scottish Parliament isn't enough, and that Scotland should have decision-making powers over all of these areas. There was a referendum in 2014 on whether Scotland should become an independent country, and 45% of people voted yes, they voted for that, and 55% of people voted no, they voted for Scotland to stay part of the United Kingdom. This is a good topic for a class debate when we're back. What do you think? For now though, have a think about how you might answer a question on devolution, on what we've just covered. Here's a recent question from a National 5 exam paper on this topic. The Scottish Parliament has responsibility for devolved matters. Describe in detail 2 devolved matters which the Scottish Parliament has responsibility. 6 marks. Now remember, you're being asked for a description of 2 devolved matters, so you need to describe 2 areas where the Scottish Parliament has responsibility. Not 1, not 3, 2. And it means you also need to give an up-to-date example. So let's take the example I gave a minute ago and start us off. So one possible way of answering this could be one devolved matter which the Scottish Parliament has responsibility for is health. That's your point, and that sentence would get you 1 mark. This means that the Parliament decides on legislation relating to the NHS in Scotland, and the Scottish Government makes decisions about Scotland's hospitals, dentists, and other health services. That's your description, you're describing the point that you made. But notice you don't just repeat the point again with a few more words thrown in, you add something more to describe what it actually means to have responsibility for health policy. Then you add an example. For example, during the coronavirus pandemic, the Scottish Government made the decision to build an emergency hospital, the Louisa Jordan in Glasgow, to deal with a possible increase in cases. So you finish up with an example as up to date as possible and with as much detail as possible. Taken together, those 3 sentences would get you 3 marks. So your task now is to have a go at finishing this question with another paragraph about a different devolved issue. You'll need to go away and do a wee bit of research and find an up-to-date example as well. That's it for devolution. Remember, Scottish Parliament deals with devolved issues like health, education, crime, the law, transport and farming. The UK Parliament deals with reserved issues like defence, foreign affairs, immigration, and most benefits. And with that, we're done. Today's Modern Studies Wee lesson finished. Bye.